Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of the California Budget and Policy Center team, we're so happy you're here with us for our webinar briefing on an overview of the governor's proposed 2020-21 state budget. I am Sarah Jimenez, Director of Communications here at the Budget Center. And the webinar today is part of our Policy Perspectives series, which is a free program made possible by a couple of our sponsors. So we want to first thank First 5 LA, First 5 California, and the Stupski Foundation. Thank you for your support of our work. Now, before our program begins, we have a couple of reminders. Our webinar presentation will be recorded and available on our website. It'll be posted later this week, so be sure to check out the website and also to make sure you share it with your colleagues in your networks. We really want to make sure that our information is provided to as many people as possible. At the end of our presentation today, we will have a Q&A portion, and so you'll be able to type in your questions in the Q&A chat box section in the GoToWebinar feature. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can, but we probably won't get to all of your questions, so please feel free to reach out to any of us in the days and weeks coming, and as the budget and legislative sessions unfold, we really do want to hear from you and be technical assistance support for all of you. And while we certainly spend a lot of our time analyzing the state budget, there are a whole range of resources that we produce all the time about many topics and policy issues that are facing low-income and middle-income Californians. So be sure to check out our website, follow us on Twitter. That's where we often advertise many of the reports that we release, and that's where you can find our latest information. And in fact, we have a really great report coming out just next week about taxes expenditures in the state from our policy analyst, Kayla Kitson. So be sure to be on the lookout for that. And now I will be handing over the program to our experts for today. You'll hear from 6 of our staff, though we have many more people here who cover our issues and help put out the great research that you rely upon. So again, if you want to hear from any of our staff, please reach out to any of us at any time. But today you'll get to hear from 6 of us. So without further delay, I'm going to hand it over to our Director of Research, Scott Graves. Scott?
My job today, over the next few minutes actually, is just to provide some high-level context for the issue area discussions that are going to be following, led by my colleagues, providing just a high-level overview of the governor's proposed 2021 budget for the fiscal year that begins on July 1st. So I think the first place we'd like to begin is with the Budget Center's bottom line on the governor's proposed budget. We think that the governor's proposed budget addresses many of the pressing needs that Californians are currently facing, but at the same time, policymakers clearly have opportunities to make additional advances, make additional investments that are needed in order to ensure that all Californians are able to live and work in our communities. So just turning to some top lines here in terms of what people typically want to know when they're asking about a budget: revenues, expenditures, and reserves. So I think on revenues, we've got some good news. The governor's budget is estimating that revenues will be coming in several $billion higher than were estimated even just a few months ago at the time that the budget for the current year was adopted. That's largely attributable to improved corporate tax receipts and also some better than expected performance by the stock market. So revenues are the baseline of our state budget, and so it's good to know that they're thought to be coming in higher as we head into the next fiscal year. In terms of expenditures, I think it's worth noting that the governor's proposed spending level is relatively restrained. If you compare spending for the current year to what the governor is proposing for the next fiscal year, total state and federal spending is up by less than 2% under the governor's proposal. And if you look just at general fund dollars, the increase would be just a little over 2%. So, you know, for folks who think that California typically spends a lot year over year, this is a year in which the governor has proposed a budget in which expenditure levels one year to the next are relatively restrained. And then in terms of reserves, many of you are already aware that California has been doing a terrific job of building up its reserves since the passage of Proposition 2 back in 2014, which tightened up the rules around our rainy day reserve and put some pretty strict requirements in place regarding general fund dollars that needed to be put into that reserve each year. We're on the path to having over $20 billion in total reserves for the current year. And under the governor's proposed budget, that would sort of eke past $21 billion under the assumptions of the governor's budget. Just to give you a sense of how big that is, that's around 13% of total general fund resources available to the state to allocate to programs and services. So California has been doing a really outstanding job of setting aside the dollars that are needed in order to make sure we don't have to make devastating cuts when the next recession comes. One of the most popular questions that we get is, does California have a surplus? Because that helps to determine whether the governor and the legislature will have additional dollars to spend in a fiscal year beyond just the requirements that the state already has in terms of programs and services. So the Legislative Analyst's Office a couple days ago released a report in which they estimated California has just under a $6 billion surplus. Another way of talking about the surplus is to use the term discretionary resources. So the governor essentially had around $6 billion that were not subject to the requirements of current law and could be allocated for new purposes. So the LAO was kind enough to share their numbers with us, which allowed us to create this chart. As you can see, the blue portion of the chart here reflects the fact that around 2/3 of discretionary resources, or the surplus, under the governor's proposed budget would go to either one-time or ongoing expenditures. The one-time portion is around $2.5 billion. The ongoing portion is around $1.4 billion. The orange portion of the bar, or sorry, the donut chart here relates to reserves. California has a discretionary reserve that's called the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties. Essentially, it's where the dollars go that haven't been allocated for anything else in particular. The governor is proposing to maintain that reserve by putting $1.6 billion into it. And then there's a small portion of the surplus that would be used for other purposes, a small tax cut and a debt-related proposal as well. So I think the takeaway here from this chart is clearly that the governor is proposing to use most of the dollars that are seen as a surplus in the coming year for one-time or ongoing expenditures. Essentially, many of them are going to be allocated in the health policy area, some in higher education. A good chunk is going to go toward homelessness, as some of my colleagues are going to be telling you in the coming minutes. But one thing I did want to point out is that there are some missed opportunities, as I noted at the outset. And my colleagues are also going to be pointing out places where the state budget for the upcoming fiscal year can do more to help ensure that Californians who are struggling to make ends meet can actually make it in California. So this is clearly where state legislators come in. They're going to be holding their initial hearings next week in the Assembly and the Senate, their overviews of the governor's budget proposal. Their respective budget committees will hold dozens of subcommittee hearings from March through May, looking into the details of the governor's proposed budget. So clearly state legislators will have their opportunity to have their voices heard. The governor's proposal is not the final version of the budget. It's sort of the first draft. Californians are also going to have their own opportunity to weigh in and help shape the final state budget that gets put into place this coming June for the fiscal year that begins on July 1st. So I hope you found that overview helpful. I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague, Sarah Kimberlin, who will be talking about homelessness and housing. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Scott. So I will talk first about homelessness funding that's available in the proposed in the budget, and then housing more broadly. To start with homelessness, California has a serious homelessness challenge. We have more than a quarter of the nation's population of homeless individuals, totaling more than 150,000 homeless residents as of last year, January. And homelessness challenges are cited as a serious concern by Californians and have attracted national attention. So it's not surprising that the administration would highlight homelessness as a key challenge facing the state and a key focus for new spending in the proposed budget. This is one of the areas with the largest amounts of new spending proposed. The administration's proposal particularly focuses on addressing street-based homelessness and expanding access to behavioral health and other supportive services. So a central strategy in the budget proposal around homelessness is spending $750 million one-time general fund to create a new fund called the California Access to Housing and Services Fund, which the governor proposes to administer through the Department of Social Services. He proposes that funding would be distributed through performance-based contracts between the state and regional administrators. The funds would be available to be used for a variety of different activities, including rental subsidies, supporting development of new affordable housing units, particularly units developed on state-owned land that has been made available for housing development, also stabilizing board and care facilities, engaging with landlords to secure housing units, tenancy support services, and case management for individuals receiving rent subsidies. In general, these uses of funding, these proposed uses of funding align with appropriate practices for preventing and addressing homelessness. There may be questions about the proposal in terms of how the funding would be administered and distributed. The details provided were fairly limited, but it's notable that this approach differs from the strategy that was adopted in the 2019-20 budget, where homelessness funding was distributed to cities, counties, and continuums of care, and not through any sort of regional administrator structure. And the administration asked the legislature to expedite the establishment of this fund in order to issue funding as early as this summer. So that's the major funding proposal directly related to homelessness, but there are other significant proposals included in the budget that aim to address the needs of homeless individuals through the state's health and behavioral health systems. My colleague Adriana will be talking about the health and behavioral health proposals in more detail, but just briefly, those that relate directly to homelessness include three in particular. One is transforming Medi-Cal in ways that improve care for individuals experiencing homelessness and/or substance use disorders. This is part of the broader Medi-Cal Healthier California for All proposal. And in part, these changes are designed to enable the Medi-Cal system to better connect individuals to services they need, including housing services. The second prong here is working to reform the Mental Health Services Act, or Proposition 63. And that includes, in this proposal, enhancing the focus on individuals with mental illness who are also experiencing homelessness. And then the final behavioral health that connects to homelessness proposal is allocating some funding to the Department of State Hospitals to implement a community care collaborative pilot program to address residential placements for individuals with mental health needs who are designated incompetent to stand trial. And the administration notes that this proposal would especially benefit individuals who are experiencing mental illness and are homeless. As I said, my colleague Adriana will in a moment speak more about these proposals in more detail, including the broader focus beyond just homelessness. So turning now from the issue of homelessness to the topic of addressing California's broader housing affordability crisis. Really, the governor proposes no significant new funding. Instead, he points to the major investments to support housing planning and production that were included in the 2019-20 budget. Many of those investments were one-time, and many of them are being implemented this calendar year. That budget also included the intention to expand the state low-income housing tax credit program by up to $500 million annually upon appropriation. And so in this 2020-21 budget, there is included a $500 million expansion of LIHTC for the current budget, for the 2020-21 budget year. Other funding related to addressing housing affordability more broadly includes just a modest $10 million annually over the next 3 years to support the state's efforts to increase housing production. I should note also the administration notes that there is some additional funding targeted to housing needs that comes as a result of a court decision last year that found that the state previously improperly diverted to the general fund $331 million that was intended for a special fund to assist California homeowners affected by the mortgage crisis. Those funds have now been deposited in a special fund, and the administration proposes managing them in a trust to support ongoing legal assistance related to housing issues for both California renters and homeowners, as well as borrower relief to prevent foreclosures. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Adriana Ramos Yamamoto.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm going to go over proposals in the governor's budget related to health, starting with Medi-Cal Healthier California for All, formerly known as CalAIM. The administration is leading a reform effort to transform Medi-Cal, which, as you know, provides healthcare services to nearly 13 million Californians with low incomes. Building on previous pilot programs, this initiative aims to coordinate physical health, behavioral health, and social services. It also aims to simplify delivery systems and shift towards a value-based model with the overall goal of improving care, particularly for Californians experiencing homelessness, children with complex medical conditions, justice-involved Californians, and older adults. As such, this would position the state to take a person-centered approach to providing services while potentially reducing healthcare costs in the long run. Implementation of these reforms would begin on January 2021. $695 million would be available during the initial fiscal year to specifically support comprehensive services to individuals and in lieu of services, which include recuperative care and respite. It would fund infrastructure needed to expand whole person care programs and build upon existing dental initiatives such as the Dental Transformation Initiative, which aims to expand preventive dental services for children. The budget also includes $45.1 million to implement a behavioral health quality improvement program to support counties in transforming their behavioral health systems and improving care coordination and value-based payment reform. One thing to note, however, is that the proposed reforms and the level of federal funding must be negotiated with the federal government through the Medicaid waiver process. Moving on to coverage and affordability. The budget proposes to expand Medi-Cal eligibility to include undocumented adults aged 65 or older beginning January 2021. The expansion would initially cost $80.5 million and increase to an estimated $350 million in 2022-23. The governor's proposal would continue to leave undocumented immigrants ages 26 to 64 without access to comprehensive Medi-Cal coverage. The budget also announced a new office, the Office of Healthcare Affordability, which would be responsible for increasing price transparency, developing cost targets for sectors of the healthcare industry, and addressing hospital cost trends. A formal plan is expected to be released in the spring of 2020. On reducing prescription drug costs, the administration is developing a plan to establish a single market for drug pricing in the state, as well as a plan to establish California's own generic drug label. Both of these plans will be released later this spring as well. And on behavioral health, the proposed 2020-2021 budget includes a number of initiatives that aim to improve behavioral health outcomes. Specifically, the administration proposes to establish the Behavioral Health Task Force with the goal of improving the quality of care and coordinate efforts under Medi-Cal Healthier California for All. There's also a focus on parity. The Health and Human Services Agency and the Department of Managed Healthcare are charged with updating and strengthening behavioral health parity laws, which require that health plans apply similar rules to mental health and substance use disorder benefits as they do for physical health benefits. These efforts will focus on timely access to treatment, network adequacy, and more. The administration is also working on a proposal to update the Mental Health Services Act, as my colleague Sarah mentioned. One of the proposed changes mentioned is to identify priority populations, including Californians experiencing homelessness, children and youth at risk, and justice-involved adults. The administration plans to release this proposal later this spring. In other efforts to improve behavioral health outcomes, the budget also includes $24.6 million in 2020-2021 to the Community Care Collaborative Pilot Program. The goal of this program is to place individuals who are designated incompetent to stand trial into stable community placements instead of state hospitals or other institutions. The budget also includes $10 million one-time funding for the development of an adverse childhood experiences cross-sector training program, as well as a statewide public awareness campaign on ACEs. This builds on the Surgeon General's goal of reducing ACEs and toxic stress for children. Also included is $4.6 million to provide training on trauma-informed support services for individuals with both developmental disabilities and mental health conditions. There's also $2.3 million ongoing funding to improve behavioral health services at veterans' homes. And with that, I will go ahead and wrap up and hand it over to my colleague, Essie Hutchful, to talk about economic security initiatives.
All right, thank you. So first, I'm going to talk about the investments that the governor made in CalWORKs, which is a program that provides cash assistance to low-income children while helping their parents find and keep jobs. CalWORKs supports over 720,000 kids, most of whom are children of color. And this makes CalWORKs a really critical support in a state where children of color are more likely than our white children to face economic insecurity. In the January proposal, the governor proposes raising CalWORKs grants by 3.1%, effective October 1st. This follows recent grant increases, including a significant raise last year in the 2019-20 budget, as the annualized grant had been well below the deep poverty threshold for over a decade. The proposal provides about $74 million in 2020-21 and $98 million in 21-22 for this increase. The governor also proposes changes to the CalWORKs child support system. So just as an explainer, currently if one parent on CalWORKs has primary custody of the child, then the other parent, also known as the non-custodial parent, is required to pay child support. However, the family actually only gets the first $50 a month of this payment. The rest goes back to the state and the federal government, the rationale being that this serves as a sort of way of reimbursing the state for the cost of providing those CalWORKs benefits. And this is true no matter how many children are in the family. So right now, the governor is proposing instead allowing parents to keep the first $100 instead of $50 for a family with one child and $200 for a family with 2 or more kids. And the proposal identifies $1.4 million in 2020-21 just to sort of get everything ready to implement these changes, and then $17 million general fund annually beginning January 1st, 2022, which is when this policy change would actually take effect. And then I want to turn to some missed opportunities to invest in economic security that we identified in the proposal. So first, I want to talk about the Young Child Tax Credit and the California Earned Income Tax Credit, also known as the Cal EITC. So as you may know, these are California's only refundable state tax credits, and that means that they're the only state tax credits that help people with very low incomes. And they help millions of Californians each year to pay their bills and to put food on the table. As you might remember, the 2019-20 budget expanded the Cal EITC to more people, it increased the size of the credit for some, and then it also created the Young Child Tax Credit, which provides an additional tax refund for families with young children who also qualify for the Cal EITC. The proposal this year simply maintains those investments that were already made last year, and the governor is not proposing any additional investments to those 2 credits for the 2021 budget. This was rather disappointing for many advocates because they were hoping that the governor would actually decide to extend the Cal EITC and the Young Child Tax Credit to the hundreds of thousands of immigrant families in our state who are currently excluded from benefiting from those tax credits, even though they do earn little from their jobs and they pay taxes. And the Senate and the Assembly actually included such an extension, proposal for such an extension in their budgets last year, but then it ended up being left out of the final deal. So this is definitely going to be a big issue to watch going forward in this year's budget debate. And then lastly, to wrap up, I want to note that the proposed budget also lacks a state increase for SSI, SSP grants. That stands for the Supplemental Security Income State Supplementary Payment Grant. It's a very long combo name. But those grants help well over 1 million low-income seniors and people with disabilities in our state to pay for housing and other necessities. And the grants actually sort of funded with federal dollars, the SSI portion, and then also with state dollars, the SSP portion. And state policymakers during the Great Recession made really deep cuts to the SSP portion of the grant because they were trying to close budget shortfalls that came about during that downturn. However, the recession has ended and we are in the midst of our recovery, but the cuts still have not been restored since that time. And in this proposal, the governor does not propose any state increase for the SSP portion of the grant in the coming budget year. So we did just want to highlight those two missed opportunities for our economic security. And on that note, I'm going to send things over to my colleague Kristen, who is going to tell us about the other proposals that we saw around economic security. Kristen?
Thank you, SC. So today I'm going to cover the budget proposals for paid family leave, subsidized childcare, and early learning. So as some of you may know, California has led the nation in creating the first state-level paid family leave program. However, after 15 years of providing benefits, it's time that our paid family leave program is updated so that more workers, and particularly workers with low wages, can actually utilize the program that they're paying into. One of the hurdles for workers is a lack of job protections, and this means that workers may be unable to utilize paid leave because they're not guaranteed their job when they return to work. And this primarily applies to workers in smaller organizations. So the governor's budget proposal would include statutory language to align paid leave benefits with job protections. Details have not been released yet, but in a stakeholder call, the administration noted that they're looking to extend job protections to employees in organizations with fewer than 20 employees. So low-wage workers, who are disproportionately women, Black, and Latinx workers, are more likely to work in smaller organizations and would really benefit from this proposal. We released a report on paid family leave just this past November with a lot of details and fun graphics. So if you're interested in the topic, I would encourage you to grab it from our website. So on to subsidized childcare. So one reason families struggle to make ends meet in California is the high cost of childcare. And this is especially true for families with low incomes. So subsidized childcare helps parents find safe and affordable childcare for their kids while they're at work. The governor's budget proposal does include an additional 621 general childcare slots with 10.3 million in cannabis fund dollars. However, we also know that roughly 2 million children are eligible for subsidized childcare and development programs in California who are actually unable to access these programs due to a lack of state and federal funds. In addition, the budget proposal also would restructure the governance of subsidized childcare programs by creating a new Department of Early Childhood Development. So childcare programs currently are administered both by the California Department of Education and the California Department of Social Services. And so that would take the childcare programs from both of these departments and put them into the new department, which would then be housed within the California Health and Human Services Agency. Finally, in regards to early learning, the governor's proposal continues to invest in the goal of universal preschool in California. And the proposal adds an additional 10,000 full-day preschool slots, which would be effective April 1, 2021. And then these spaces are funded with 32 million general fund. The proposal also includes some funding for facilities, early learning facilities, includes an additional 75 million Prop 98 for the Inclusive Early Education Expansion Program. This is a facilities grant program established in 1819 budget agreements to increase access to early learning for children with special needs. In a call with the administration, they noted that demand for these funds has been quite high, and so we're excited that they'll be providing additional funds. Lastly, the proposal would increase flexibility for the full-day kindergarten facilities grant program. So the goal of this grant program is to build or retrofit school district facilities so they can transition from part-day kindergarten programs to full-day programs. However, only a quarter of the $400 million in available funds has been used so far. So this proposal, the governor's proposal, would set aside a portion of the remaining funds for school districts building or modifying preschool facilities as well. So this is an attempt just to make sure that we fully utilize the dollars in the full day kindergarten facilities grant program. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathan Kaplan, who'll talk more about education.
Thanks, Kristen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be talking to you today about funding for K-12 schools and community colleges first, and then the higher education institutions you see in CSU, as well as also student aid. So every year, a key issue that underlies the governor's proposed budget is how much the state is required to provide for K-12 schools and community colleges. The state meets this minimum funding guarantee, also known as Proposition 98, through a combination of state general fund and local property tax revenues. The Prop 98 funding level is not something that the governor or the legislature decide, but rather is determined by complicated formulas that are affected by several factors, including estimates of how the state's economy and the state's general fund will do in the future. Because the governor's budget proposal and his estimates indicate that state general fund revenues will continue to grow this year and next, the minimum funding guarantee for K-12 schools and community colleges also is increasing. Compared to estimates of the 2019-20 Prop 98 funding level that were included in last June's budget agreement, the Prop 98 guarantee is estimated to increase by roughly $3 billion in 2020-21. So the governor proposes to use these Prop 98 funding dollars that he estimates will be available in a few ways. For K-12 education, the governor proposes to use the largest share, $1.2 billion, to increase funding for the state's local control funding formula for K-12 schools, which provides a base level of funding for all students and additional dollars for students who come from low-income families, are English learners, or who are in foster care. Governor Newsom's proposed budget also provides significant funding to address the shortage of educators in the state by allocating $900 million for recruitment, preparation, and training. And so that's a significant amount of dollars that are proposed for those purposes. The governor's budget also proposes significant funding, about $1 billion in total, to address students who are facing particular challenges. This includes $300 million for grants to support community schools, which are designed to provide students integrated educational, health, and mental health services. Another $300 million for grants to assist low-performing school districts to address achievement gaps. $250 million for special education funding as part of a multi-phase process intended to reform how special education funding is provided in the state, and another $70 million to increase school nutrition funding. So that's on the K-12 side. Prop 98 funding also helps support California's community colleges. In addition to providing $200 million for enrollment growth and covering cost of living adjustments at community colleges, the governor's proposal for the state's community colleges focuses on workforce development and apprenticeship programs, for which he provides $100 million. And proposed community college funding also includes $15 million for much needed assistance for undocumented and immigrant students, $15 million for a pilot program to improve the diversity of community college faculty, and roughly $10 million each to support food banks on community college campuses and to help reduce the cost of textbooks at community colleges. Now, for the state's higher education institutions aside from community colleges, the governor's proposed budget proposes ongoing funding increases of about 5% for the California State University, and the University of California systems, or roughly $200 million for the CSU and $170 million for the UC. Now, notably, unlike in prior years, the governor's proposal for these funding increases are not tied to an expectation that the UC and CSU will maintain tuition and fee levels at the current rates. Lastly, the budget proposal addresses student loan debt by including $5 million to support a student loan working group and development of a website that would provide information regarding loan programs, repayment plans, and debt forgiveness options. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Scott Graves, who will be talking to us about corrections.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, so what I want to do over the next few minutes now, wrapping up our overview of some key areas of the state budget proposal, is to look at 3 of the governor's proposals in the area of criminal justice, 1 at the state level and 2 at the local level. So at the state level, perhaps the biggest news is that the governor's has announced that the state is assuming that California will be able to close a state-operated prison within the next 5 years. That would be a really significant milestone for the state to meet, given the vast sort of prison industrial complex we built up here in California. So to be able to scale back our prison system would be a really substantial policy gain for the state. In the meantime, as California works toward closing a state prison, the state's goal is to begin closing a number of in-state contract facilities, both public and private, that house men outside of the walls of state prisons. So the governor and the legislature, essentially through legislation and the governor's own policy priorities, have been prioritizing closing contract facilities, including out-of-state facilities, now focusing on in-state facilities, with the goal ultimately within 5 years of being able to close for the first time a state-operated prison. At the local level, the governor has some significant proposals. I'm going to go over a couple of them. One relates to county probation. The governor is proposing some reforms related to probation. Probation is essentially a sentence that is served in the community rather than through incarceration. Right now, there are a lot of people who have been convicted of misdemeanors at the county level who are on probation but are not being supervised and not being provided services. They're called banked caseloads. Essentially, they're not getting services. So the governor is suggesting that in order to help break the cycle of crime, it would be better if for the state to provide the resources that counties would need in order to begin providing services to folks who are convicted of certain misdemeanors and on probation at the county level. The governor is also proposing to limit probation terms to 2 years. Currently, they can run from 3 to 5 years. Apparently, the research indicates that 2 years is about as much time as you want someone to spend in probation if you are providing the services and resources that they need in order to successfully re-enter society. So those are a couple of big proposals on the probation side. The governor is also proposing to chip away at the skyrocketing criminal justice fines and fees that have really weighed down many people across California. His proposal would take a pilot program that's been operating for the last year or so in 4 counties and gradually scale it up statewide. Essentially, what this program does is it allows people to reduce the amount of fines and fees they owe for various traffic and non-traffic infractions, which can run to the high hundreds to even more than $1,000, which is much more than many people with low incomes or even middle income households can realistically afford in their budgets. So the governor is essentially saying that he wants to begin sort of scaling back fines and fees. The reality, though, is that our trial courts in California receive more than $1 billion in support per year through fines and fees. So this is sort of an opening effort here to begin to chip away at a big problem. In order to fully solve it, the state would have to be willing to sort of devote general fund resources in the range of $1 billion to $1.5 billion in order to fully scale back a lot of these administrative fines and fees that are really burdening Californians. So I'll leave that there with respect to criminal justice. What I'm going to do now is hand it back over to our comms director, Sarah Jimenez, who will lead the Q&A session. Sarah.
Great, thank you, Scott. Thank you to all our policy analysts for sharing some main highlights from the proposed budget. And certainly, like we said, there's much more to be covered. And you can reach out to anyone who you saw speak today and any of our other team members who are here at the Budget Center. So I thought I'd start with one of the questions we received, and probably back to Scott, but certainly others can chime in, was sort of a broad question, and particularly helpful for those who are newer to the budget process. What happens next? Certainly people probably know about May revise, have heard about the final budget, but Scott, can you talk just a little bit about what happens next after the governor has this proposed budget, some steps that happen next before we get to May revise and a budget that is approved? And also maybe you could point people to a couple resources that you've produced that can help people have a guide to understand what's going to be coming in the next few weeks and months.
Hi, sure. That's a really great question. I think that what people need to realize is that the end game here is essentially 5 months away. 5 months from today, the legislature is required by the state constitution to pass a balanced budget bill. So you might think of it as we have 5 months. We actually have less than 5 months because there's a lot of lead time that you need to sort of get the final budget package together. So what's going to happen next week is both the Assembly and Senate budget committees are going to hold overview hearings of the governor's proposed budget. I believe the Assembly's on Wednesday and the Senate is on Thursday. Then after that, things might get a little bit quiet in terms of the legislature as the staff of the budget committees pull together the agendas that they're going to be producing for each of the subcommittee hearings that will be held during March, April, and into May. There will literally be dozens of hearings that will be held across that time period, across the two houses. So that's a really good opportunity for people who want to engage in the budget process at this time of the year to be figuring out, what do they need to be doing in order to get their voices heard before these budget subcommittees that are going to be making some really crucial decisions, essentially deciding what is the Assembly's version of the budget going to look like, what's the Senate's version of the budget look like, how are those going to mesh together, and how are they going to mesh together with the priorities that Governor Newsom has set out in his January budget proposal. So we do have a couple of resources on our website that I could point folks to. A lot of you might already be familiar with them. We have a guide to the state budget process. We also have a guide that talks about the relationship between the state budget process and the policy bill process, because although some people think of those two processes as being hermetically sealed and the two never meet, in fact, many seasoned advocates know that there's a lot of overlap between those two processes. And really smart advocates know how to use each process together in order to advance their policy priorities over the coming months. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Scott. So our next question comes around paid family leave programs. So we'll send this to Kristen Schumacher, give her a moment to come back on. And Kristen, the question, and hopefully we're understanding this person's intent here, is around job protections and whether it's proposed to be, whether job protections would be phased in or staggered for employers who have fewer employees. Similar, and the way the person described it was similar to how minimum wage has been staggered in for implementation. Could you maybe expand on that a bit more?
That's a great question, and the details are very vague, and we just simply don't know. We're going to have to wait to hear from the administration and trailer bill language exactly how they'll extend job protections to workers in smaller organizations. But I can't answer that right now because the details just aren't there.
Another question for you is if there details exist, can you clarify if increased funding for childcare spaces is just for subsidized care?
Yes, so the increased funding for subsidized childcare is just subsidized spaces in the general child care program, 621.
And another question for Kristen. A lot of interest in early care and paid family leave. The department that would be formed in early childhood development, what are some of the programs that would come into that? Do we know right now?
So the subsidized childcare programs, I have the list here, so I'll read them. Please bear with me. It's the Early Childhood Policy Council, CalWORKs Childcare, voucher-based programs like the Alternative Payment Program, direct contract programs like General Child Care, Head Start and Early Head Start, the Early Education Data System, the Emergency Child Care Bridge Program for foster children, and then child care quality programs as well. Though I would note that the California State Preschool Program will not be within this new department. It will remain with the California Department of Education as proposed right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This one we'll give to Sarah Kimberlin, if you could come back on for a moment. Around homelessness.
All right.
See where if do we know a little bit? Can you talk a little bit more about the regional administration model of the flow of the homelessness dollars? Anything more you can say on that?
You know, that is an area I think where we would be looking for more details to come from the administration. There's not a lot of detail right now. As I noted earlier, this would be a different model than the administration had used last year, for example, to distribute homelessness funding, which went through local governments and communities of care. So, continuums of care. So, yeah, well, we're waiting to find out more about how the administration envisions that this would work.
Thanks, Sarah. And if our colleague Alyssa Anderson is maybe on, we have a question about EITC, and I know Essie maybe can also jump on, but if Alyssa is listening. We know there were a lot of, you mentioned, I think, a lot of efforts to have the expansion to immigrant families and immigrant communities for the Cal Earned Income Tax Credit. Anything more that you could say, Alyssa or Essie, about maybe just even some of the benefits of doing so, or what some of our research has found?
This is Alyssa. I'm on. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Alyssa.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we also have a lot of resources about this on our website, and people can certainly feel free to reach out to me directly if they want to learn more. But I mean, one thing I would say is that we know that poverty, and especially child poverty, is a huge problem in California. We also know, and I don't think most people realize this, most children in poverty live in working families. And so a key reason why they're in poverty is because their families don't earn enough. And so, one of the best tools to address working poverty is the Earned Income Tax Credit. And California created a state version of the credit and then built on it last year by extending a new credit to families who qualify for the CalATC, the Young Child Tax Credit. And this is one of the best tools that the state has to reduce poverty, help working families make ends meet. But unfortunately, a lot of people in our state are left out of these credits, even though they earn very little from their job and they pay their taxes. And so we've estimated that hundreds of thousands of immigrant families are left out. And this is basically because when state policymakers created the CalATC and the Young Child Tax Credit, they piggybacked on eligibility rules for the federal EITC, and the federal EITC excludes immigrants who don't have a social security number that's valid for work. And this was a rule that was put into place in the mid-90s as part of so-called welfare reform, which severely restricted major federal benefits for many immigrants. And so California's exclusion of many immigrants from our state credits is essentially rooted in this anti-immigrant federal policy. And it leads to really huge disparities in after-tax income. Parents have exactly the same earnings from work, where children whose parents have Social Security numbers have much higher incomes compared to children whose parents don't, even though they're earning the same amount from their jobs. So that's, sort of briefly why this is important, and we have a lot of resources on our website that I'd be happy to point people to.
Thanks, Alyssa. We have somebody who, it's more of a comment, but I would encourage this person who's talking about wanting to know more about funding on workforce development, specifically at community colleges. Thank you for that. I'd really encourage you to reach out to our lead analyst on higher education. That would be Amy Rose, and you can find her information on our website. So if you're still on our webinar, and I hope you are, please follow up with that. And I think that's about all the time we have for questions for today. So thank you everyone for putting in your questions. And again, if we didn't get to a question or there's something really specific you want to ask, please visit our staff page on our website. That's www.calbudgetcenter.org, and you can find all of our contact information there. And then one more plug before we wrap up today. Please join us for our annual conference, Policy Insights 2020. It will take place on Monday, March 9th here in Sacramento at the Sheraton Sacramento in downtown, just a blocks away from the Capitol. This is really a great event, and I don't say that just because I work for the Budget Center, but I attended it well before I started working for the Budget Center. We have a lot of great sessions. You can see some of the content. We'll have Senator Holly Mitchell among many speakers. It's also our 25th anniversary. So please, if you do one thing today, go to our website, register. We often fill up and max out on our registration, so you don't want to miss out on that. And please share the registration link with your colleagues and make sure that you get in. So with that, again, want to remind you that this recording will be on our website by the end of this week. And we are always here to assist you with any budget or policy analysis, data, or other information you're looking for. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation.